He thought staying silent kept his daughter safe. Until the morning her teacher's classroom was covered in hate. The town called it a prank, but the look in his little girl's eyes told him the truth. That day, he realized the danger wasn't in speaking up. It was in what his silence had already taught her. The town had always kept certain lines invisible until the day someone crossed them without asking permission. Maple Ridge was a small dot on the map, the kind of town where the streets seemed to repeat themselves, and everyone knew which topics to avoid. It looked peaceful from a distance, green porches, still air, unchanging routines. But that peace was the kind that required someone to stay outside the circle. Ethan Cole had learned to live within those circles. Since his wife's passing 2 years ago, his life had become predictable, deliberately narrow. He ran the same auto shop his father once owned, working until his hands hurt, then going home to the same quiet house on Birch Street. Sophie, his 7-year-old daughter, was the only piece of his world that still felt alive. Her laughter slipped through the stillness like sunlight between blinds, warming corners that Ethan preferred to keep dim. He guarded her fiercely, convinced that routine was protection and isolation was safety. He kept her close, kept her schedule simple, and believed that in doing so, he was honoring his wife's memory. But the rhythm of Maple Ridge changed when Maya Thompson arrived. She was young, confident, and new, a black schoolteacher in a town that wasn't used to difference. Her smile was the kind that disarmed suspicion, but suspicion still lingered. On her first morning, people at the diner turned their heads too quickly. Conversations dropped when she passed. It wasn't hostility at first. It was something quieter, a collective discomfort that smelled faintly of history. Ethan saw her that day at the diner. She stood by the counter, polite but firm, her presence stirring the room's hidden rules. When the waitress told her they were short on seating, even though empty tables sat near the window, Maya nodded with dignity and walked out. The hush that followed was thick. Ethan, standing by the door, watched her leave and felt something unpleasant rise in his chest. It wasn't anger, it was recognition. He had seen wrongness before but never known what to do with it. This time, like every other, he did nothing. The next morning, Sophie came home from school talking about Ms. Thompson. She described her as kind, funny, and not like other teachers. Sophie spoke with unfiltered warmth, her excitement filling the house like music Ethan didn't want to dance to. He nodded absently, pretending not to listen, though every word landed heavier than the last. It unsettled him that his daughter could see light where he saw potential trouble. At night, after Sophie went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the local paper. There was a small piece about the school welcoming its new faculty. Maya's name was listed at the bottom. He tried not to look at the picture beside it, but found himself staring anyway. She didn't look like trouble. She looked like someone trying to start over. He wondered what kind of courage it took to walk into a place that wasn't ready for you. He told himself it wasn't his concern and folded the paper closed. Days passed. The town adjusted to her presence by pretending she wasn't there, the same way they had adjusted to years of difference by ignoring it. At the grocery store, people smiled without eye contact. At church, the pew beside her stayed empty. Ethan noticed, but told himself noticing wasn't the same as involvement. Then came the moment he couldn't ignore. He was fixing a customer's car outside the diner when he saw her again, walking down Main Street with a book in her hand. She glanced up, offering a small, polite nod, the kind of acknowledgement shared between two people who have no reason to distrust each other yet. Ethan hesitated, his response trapped somewhere between courtesy and discomfort. The nod he returned was half-hearted, almost reluctant. That evening, Sophie talked again about Ms. Thompson, about the stories she told, about the way she made the class draw what kindness looked like. Ethan forced a smile, but his chest felt heavy. He couldn't explain why it bothered him to know his daughter admired someone the town had already judged. He called it caution, called it parental care, but deep down, he recognized it for what it was, fear dressed as reason. That night, when the house grew still, he caught himself thinking of the diner door closing, of Maya walking away with her head high, and of himself standing frozen, pretending it wasn't his business. He realized with quiet dread that the man turning away in that reflection wasn't a stranger. It was him. Guilt lingered like a stain, and you only notice when the light tilts the right way. Ethan had always believed he was a decent man, one who worked hard, paid his bills, and stayed out of trouble. Yet lately, even the smallest reminders of kindness left him uneasy. Sophie, his daughter, had become fascinated by her teacher in a way that felt almost disloyal to the world he'd built. She spoke about Miss Thompson with an excitement that filled the kitchen, her stories tumbling over one another like marbles escaping a jar. There was an ease in her voice, a purity that made Ethan feel older than his years. In Maya Thompson's classroom, Sophie's world had widened. Her drawings, once small and careful, began to spill across pages. She drew parks, classrooms, and smiling faces that looked nothing like the town around her. The colors were brighter, the lines bolder. Maya encouraged every child to see beauty in imperfection. For the shy, she offered patience. For the loud, direction. When Sophie showed her father these pictures, he smiled, out of duty, but couldn't shake the feeling that her world was growing beyond the reach of his control. One Thursday afternoon, a note arrived from Maya. It was short, written in neat cursive, and folded so precisely that Ethan hesitated before opening it. Inside, she thanked him for raising such a curious and kind-hearted child. Sophie notices the small things, it read. She listens when others don't. The message was simple, yet it carried a warmth the house hadn't felt in a long time. Ethan read it twice, set it on the counter, and tried not to think about why it unsettled him. The handwriting felt too personal, the sincerity too close. He folded it again, placing it beneath the newspaper, as if hiding it could dull its truth. The next week, Ethan arrived early for pickup. The playground stretched before him like a theater where the same scenes replayed every day. But that afternoon, the air held a tension he couldn't name. Near the swing set, a small group of children stood around a quiet boy whose lunchbox had been thrown into the dirt. The laughter was sharp, rehearsed, almost routine. Ethan froze as he watched Maya cross the yard, her steps measured and calm. She knelt beside the boy, brushed the dust from his sleeve, and spoke softly. Too softly to be heard, but enough to quiet the crowd. Her composure disarmed them more effectively than anger could. The ringleaders shuffled, embarrassed, while the others drifted away, their fun spoiled by decency. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, an ache that had nothing to do with loss, but everything to do with recognition. He'd seen cruelty before, but always from the safety of distance. Watching Maya restore a child's dignity with nothing but grace made his own silence feel like participation. He told himself that such things didn't happen in Maple Ridge, not here, not among good people. Yet the truth was standing in front of him, quiet and undeniable, wrapped in a teacher's calm patience. That evening, the house felt smaller. Sophie hummed to herself while drawing at the kitchen table, the same table where Ethan now avoided sitting. She talked about the incident in vague terms, describing how Ms. Thompson always makes bad things feel lighter. Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice. Her words made him think about all the times he'd stayed silent in his own life, mistaking inaction for peace. After Sophie went to bed, he washed the dishes slowly, one by one, as though delaying thought. Each sound of porcelain meeting water seemed to echo in the quiet house. He caught sight of Maya's note again beneath the paper, edges slightly curled. Something in him resisted, but he reached for it anyway. He read the words a third time, letting them sink past the layer of guilt he'd tried to ignore. It struck him that the note was addressed to Sophie, yet its weight belonged to him. It wasn't praise, it was a mirror. It spoke of empathy, of noticing, of listening, when others don't. Ethan realized how rarely he had done any of those things. He felt exposed, as though the handwriting itself saw through him. Outside, the night stretched over Maple Ridge, quiet and vast. Ethan sat alone, the note trembling slightly in his hand, the paper thinner than it looked. It felt like more than a message. It felt like an invitation and an accusation, both at once. For the first time in years, he didn't fold it back up. He just stared at it, knowing that accountability had finally found him, written in someone else's gentle ink. A single kind decision can become a mirror, and not everyone likes the face that looks back. The morning of Sophie's birthday broke with the scent of sugar and sunlight. Ethan had spent the week preparing for it, or at least convincing himself he had. The decorations hung crooked but cheerful across the small backyard, and the folding table stood ready under the maple tree. He told himself it was just another children's gathering, cake, laughter, photographs, but something in him knew it was more. Sophie had asked, with that certain smile she'd inherited from her mother, if Ms. Thompson could come. Ethan had hesitated longer than necessary before agreeing. To refuse would have meant explaining his discomfort, and he had no language for that explanation. By mid-afternoon, the guests arrived. Neighbors carried covered dishes and gifts wrapped in shiny paper. Their greetings were polite, but their glances restless, as though the air held an extra question they couldn't name aloud. Ethan played host with mechanical ease, his smile polished by habit. Sophie fluttered between adults, laughter spilling in bright bursts that seemed to soften even the most watchful faces. When Maya arrived, conversation thinned like smoke in wind. She came with a quiet grace that made her presence unmistakable but never demanding. In her hands, she carried a gift, an unassuming package tied with twine. She greeted Ethan with polite warmth, and for a brief moment he felt something loosen inside him. It wasn't comfort, not exactly, but a small break in the wall he'd built between fear and curiosity. Sophie tore through her gifts with the zeal of childhood, until Maya's package appeared in her lap. Inside was a handmade book, its pages blank except for a few small illustrations on the corners. "For your drawings," Maya had written on the first page, in a looping hand that carried quiet confidence. "Fill it with your own worlds." Sophie clutched it like a treasure, eyes wide with gratitude. Ethan felt an unfamiliar ache, the kind that came from remembering tenderness after too long without it. The party carried on with laughter that felt increasingly practiced. Children played. Adults exchanged looks, heavy with subtext. The weather was pleasant, the cake sweet, and yet Ethan sensed something delicate beginning to fracture. It happened when one of the men, Tom, his neighbor since childhood, made a remark wrapped in humor but lined with venom. "Didn't expect such fancy presents around here," he said, his grin too wide, his tone just light enough to deny insult. The laughter that followed was uneven, polite, forced. Ethan froze. The words hung in the air like dust, visible and ugly, but no one dared brush them away. Maya stood still, her composure unshaken, though the pause in her breath was enough to expose the bruise of it. She offered a smile, a careful one, practiced for rooms like this, and turned her attention back to Sophie. The child's happiness became her shield. Ethan watched her navigate the cruelty with grace and felt a sudden awareness of his own cowardice. The rest of the afternoon blurred. The plates emptied, the lights softened, and the party wound down with awkward farewells. Neighbors gathered their dishes, leaving behind polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Sophie clung to her new book, oblivious to the tension that had knotted itself into the adults' voices. Ethan thanked Maya for coming, his words brittle, his hands restless. She smiled gently, told Sophie she'd see her Monday, and walked toward the street. When the gate clicked shut, Ethan exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The backyard was quiet now, only paper plates, half-empty glasses, and the faint trace of laughter that no longer felt innocent. Inside, the kitchen smelled of vanilla frosting and something heavier, a quiet regret. He began cleaning mechanically, scrubbing at counters as though wiping away the unease. Yet the silence pressed closer with every motion. He remembered the look on Maya's face when the remark was made. Not hurt exactly, but knowing. She had seen this before, countless times, and still chosen to meet it with dignity. Ethan told himself he'd speak next time, that there'd be a better moment. But even as he thought it, the words rang hollow. He'd said the same thing once at his wife's funeral, promising Sophie he'd always stand up for what mattered. Promises, he realized, were easier than action. By the time the last dish was clean, dusk had taken the sky. The house looked peaceful again, but the peace felt undeserved. Sophie had fallen asleep clutching her gift, her face soft and trusting. Ethan stood in the doorway, staring out into the empty yard, the air thick with all he hadn't said. Later that night, as he turned off the porch light, he saw Maya's face again, not in memory, but in something deeper. Her calm expression replayed itself behind his eyes, not angry, not disappointed, just questioning. It was the kind of look that stripped away excuses. She hadn't asked for words. Her silence had asked for courage, and he had none to give. Regret collects interest. The longer it sits, the more it costs. The school sat quietly under the dull morning light, its brick walls holding a new, ugly truth. No one could ignore it. The spray paint screamed across the entrance in bold, jagged letters. The words were cruel, deliberate, and unmistakable. They were meant to wound, to remind, to place boundaries back where change had begun to blur them. When the first students arrived, a hush fell over the parking lot. Some parents gasped, others averted their eyes, and then the whispers started. Short, safe phrases like, "just a prank," and "kids these days," the kind that reduced hate to mischief. The custodian stood there frozen, staring at the wall like a man facing a storm with a broom. By the time Maya arrived, the damage had already been seen, photographed, and gossiped over. The air was thick with pity that asked nothing of anyone. She paused in front of the wall, her expression unreadable, the words reflecting faintly in her eyes. The principal approached her with a rehearsed line about insurance claims and community cleanups. Maya thanked him politely and walked away before the conversation could become an apology. She didn't need sympathy. She needed action. Inside the classrooms, confusion buzzed like static. Sophie sat at her desk, her fingers clenched around her pencil. Her teacher's calm presence steadied the room, but the calm was not silence. It was control. Maya spoke about art that heals, about replacing ugliness with something better. She didn't address the vandalism directly, but her lesson was a kind of defiance. Sophie understood enough to feel the weight of it. She went home that afternoon quiet and wide-eyed, her words trembling as she told her father what she'd seen. Ethan listened, and for the first time, he couldn't hide behind indifference. Something inside him cracked, not loudly, but with a pressure that would not stop growing. Dusk came heavy and slow. Ethan found himself driving toward the school without planning to. The sun was a red smear behind the trees, and the parking lot was nearly empty. The swing sets creaked in the wind, the kind of sound that reminded him of his daughter's laughter before the world became complicated. He parked beside the curb, engine running longer than it should, as if he still needed permission to be there. Through the glass doors, he saw her. Maya was alone, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, a bucket of soapy water at her side. She was scrubbing the wall, slow and steady, the rhythm of her hands patient and precise. Each stroke erased a letter, each rinse of the rag reclaiming space stolen from her. The sight was simple and devastating. No audience, no outrage, no recognition, just persistence. Dignity had its own kind of power, and Ethan felt the shape of it pressing against the hollowness he'd been carrying. He stood at the doorway, unsure whether to move closer or retreat. The air between them was filled with things unspoken, the party, the silence, the look she had given him. He realized this was the border between who he had been and who he could be. For years, he had done nothing wrong, and that had been his comfort. But tonight, nothing wrong began to feel dangerously close to nothing at all. He took a few steps forward. The sound of the brush against brick was the only thing that filled the silence. He watched her rinse the rag again, her hands red from the cold water. He wanted to say something, but didn't know how to begin. Instead, he reached for another brush leaning against the bucket. His hand trembled, but once the bristles met the wall, the motion steadied. Together, they worked in wordless rhythm. The letters faded, piece by piece, until only faint outlines remained. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't enough. But it was a beginning. Each movement rewrote something he'd left undone. The town preferred meetings and polite statements, but the quiet act of cleaning felt truer than any committee. Ethan realized courage didn't always roar. It sometimes whispered in soap and paint thinner. When the last smear disappeared, he stepped back, chest tight, breath unsteady. The wall looked cleaner, though traces of pain lingered beneath the fresh surface. He didn't know if the paint would hold or if the words would return. But for once, he had stood where he needed to. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of detergent and rain. As he turned to leave, his eyes caught the reflection of the empty hallway inside. Rows of lockers, fluorescent lights, stillness waiting to be disturbed again. And for the first time, he wondered not about what he had done, but about what he would do next. When the last smear faded, a new question rose in his mind. Would he still stand when the lights were on and the town was watching? Courage is heavier in daylight because someone is always keeping score. The days after the vandalism passed with a deceptive calm. The wall had been cleaned, repainted, and photographed for the local paper as proof that Maple Ridge was a community that takes swift action. The headline sounded proud, but the silence underneath told the truth. People liked problems best when they could be solved in a single photo. Ethan saw the newspaper on the counter at the shop and turned it face down. He'd spent years believing that being neutral made him decent. Now neutrality felt like cowardice with better manners. Gossip found its way to him faster than facts ever did. It came in fragments. Customers leaning across the counter, co-workers trading half smiles and warnings disguised as jokes. His boss, Mr. Tanner, cornered him one afternoon with advice dressed as concern. "You're a good man, Ethan," he'd said, lowering his voice like a confidant. "But folks here remember who stands where. Reputation's fragile. Don't let someone else's mess pull you in." The tone was friendly. The message wasn't. It was a boundary drawn by someone who had never been told no by the world. Ethan nodded and cataloged the words like loose change he didn't want to count. Meanwhile, Maya kept showing up. Her calm was not resignation. It was muscle memory. She arranged her classroom each morning to face the light, the desks neat and welcoming. Children entered wary and left steadier, as if learning from the quiet tone of her endurance. She didn't talk about the vandalism, didn't mention the whispers she surely heard. Her resilience wasn't loud. It was methodical, a discipline that rebuilt the day one routine at a time. Ethan started noticing her steadiness, the way a mechanic notices an engine running too quietly to be ordinary. It was a language he didn't yet speak but wanted to learn. He'd drop Sophie off early and catch glimpses through the window. Maya opening blinds, pinning children's drawings on the wall, replacing ugliness with creation. He found himself thinking of her not with curiosity, but with recognition. There was strength in what she didn't allow to break her. Then came the letter. Not the first in Maple Ridge, but the kind that still made your hands shake. Maya found it on her porch one morning, typed, unsigned, and hateful. The words were predictable. Leave while you can. Take your lesson somewhere else. There was no creativity in cruelty, only repetition. But this time, Sophie found it first. She'd run up to the porch to drop off flowers she'd picked from the garden. When she came back down, the paper trembled in her small hands. Ethan arrived moments later, and the look on Maya's face as she saw her student holding that letter tightened something inside him that would not loosen again. He could have hidden it, taken it, thrown it away, pretended it hadn't happened. Hiding would have made life easier, cleaner, but easy and clean were the languages of silence. He could have taken it to the authorities too, but he'd lived in Maple Ridge long enough to know how official channels worked. Slowly, politely, until the urgency dried up and the victim felt guilty for caring. So he chose something different. He chose presence. It wasn't grand or heroic. It was small, quiet, consistent. He began to check in after dark, not with promises or pity, but with small action. A porch light fixed, tires checked, groceries carried. He didn't call it help, and Maya didn't call it gratitude. It was understanding that didn't require words. Trust didn't arrive in a speech or a moment. It arrived in increments. It came through gestures that asked for nothing back. Maya learned to accept them the way she accepted sunlight, naturally, cautiously, knowing it could disappear without notice. Ethan, in turn, learned to see himself through her calm, not as a rescuer, but as someone finally willing to stop running from decency. The town didn't approve. Some people's eyes lingered too long when they saw him walking. Sophie to class. Others turned away faster than before. But the noise outside grew smaller compared to the stillness he found in doing the right thing without permission. He understood now that change didn't need witnesses. It needed endurance. One morning, as he was locking up his shop, a flyer caught his attention on the community board. Its headline read, "Public Meeting, Reviewing School Values." The words looked neat, civic, harmless. But everyone in Maple Ridge knew exactly what they meant. The meeting wasn't about values, it was about Maya, and the real trial would be of the people willing to say her name out loud. The room smelled like coffee and judgment before the first sentence landed. The meeting had been scheduled for 7, but by 6:30, the chairs were full. The town hall buzzed with small talk and suspicion, a steady hum of people who thought they were there to protect something sacred. The air was heavy with self-importance, the kind that hides fear beneath the word values. On the far wall, a banner read, "Maple Ridge Unified School Board," but tonight it might as well have said, "Court of Public Opinion." Every seat had a face Ethan recognized, and each one seemed to have already chosen a side. Maya sat near the front, back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. The harsh, fluorescent lights reflected on the polished floor, catching the quiet strength in her stillness. She didn't blend into the background, even though that would have been safer. Instead, she positioned herself where the light touched her face. There was no anger in her expression, only composure and exhaustion that had learned how to stand. When the board members shuffled papers and cleared throats, the microphones crackled, amplifying the voices of men who believed fairness meant keeping things the way they were. They spoke in polished sentences about tradition, community comfort, and maintaining balance. The words were dressed in courtesy but carried accusation beneath the seams. They never said her name, yet everyone knew who they were talking about. Every phrase was a veil pulled over the same idea. That change had come to town and made people uncomfortable. Ethan sat near the back, jaw tight, hands folded on his knees. For most of his life, he'd stayed silent during moments like this, believing silence kept him safe. But the air in that room, it was thick enough to choke on. When the time came for public comment, he rose before he knew he would. The legs of his chair scraped against the floor, and the sound drew every head his way. He didn't have a speech prepared. His palms were slick and his throat burned, but something inside him refused to shrink this time. He spoke not about politics or policy, but about what he had seen. The classroom filled with color, the way Maya's steadiness had changed the children, the way kindness had become an act of quiet defiance. His voice didn't rise, yet the room listened. Conviction, he realized, didn't need to be loud to echo. When he finished, the silence was short-lived. A man in the corner scoffed, muttering about outsiders stirring up division. Someone else said Ethan had forgotten his roots. The board thanked him in that clipped way people use to close a conversation they don't want to have. The meeting continued, but something irreversible had shifted. Ethan sat down again, his pulse steady, his fear gone. He felt lighter, not because the fight was over, but because he had finally chosen a side worth standing on. The backlash came almost immediately. The next morning, 2 customers called to cancel their appointments at his auto shop. By afternoon, a third one found someone closer. The week went on like that, polite excuses wrapped in avoidance. Friends he'd known since childhood suddenly became busy. Conversation stopped mid-sentence when he walked into the diner. Even Sophie noticed. "Why don't people smile at us anymore?" she asked one night. Ethan didn't have an answer she'd understand. Then came the message on his garage door. Thick, black paint, the kind of slur that burned hotter because it wasn't meant for him, but it was now. It was meant for anyone who crossed the line the town pretended didn't exist. He stood there a long time, staring at it under the dim streetlight. No one stopped to help, though a few cars slowed as they passed. Finally, he went inside, filled a bucket, and grabbed a brush. He worked until his arms ached, until the words disappeared under gray paint. The rhythm of scrubbing felt familiar, almost meditative. He wasn't just cleaning a wall, he was rewriting the part of himself that used to stand still. Later, as the moon lifted over Maple Ridge, he looked at the freshly painted door and saw not defiance, but peace. He understood something he hadn't before. Protection wasn't about hiding Sophie from ugliness. It was about teaching her what to do when she saw it. Change didn't start with crowds. It started in moments like this, when one person refused to be small. Across town, Maya's porch light flickered in the dark. On her doormat lay a sealed envelope from the school board, its edges bent slightly from the wind. Even before she opened it, she knew it carried the shape of a decision made behind closed doors. The night was quiet, too quiet. Maple Ridge waited for what would come next. Decisions arrive like weather. You can't stop the clouds, but you can choose where to stand. The envelope on Maya's porch looked harmless. Its edges curled slightly from the wind, but its weight was anything but light. The school board seal was pressed in the corner, the kind of official stamp that made cruelty look procedural. Inside, the letter used professional language to do unprofessional harm. Words like policy and review and community consideration were arranged neatly, stripped of humanity. Contract under review was the phrase that hit hardest. Plain enough to sound fair, cold enough to remove accountability. Maya read it twice, each sentence confirming what she already suspected. This wasn't about her performance. It was about the comfort of people who didn't want to change. She folded the paper carefully, the way someone folds a keepsake, not out of respect for the message, but for the endurance it would require to live with it. Ethan stood nearby, unable to offer comfort that wouldn't sound small. Watching her, He realized how unfairly easy it was for him to be brave beside her, how his support carried the privilege of choice, while hers carried survival. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was heavy with the understanding of what courage costs. That weekend, Ethan offered to repaint the garage wall again, though the gray layer from the last act of defiance still held firm. "It doesn't need it," Maya said quietly, but he shook his head. "Maybe we do." They painted in companionable silence, the rhythmic motion a kind of meditation. The work didn't require two people, but grief did. And the act of fixing something tangible felt like progress in a world where change came slow. Sophie played nearby, her laughter a bright interruption to the heaviness, her small voice rising over the scrape of brushes. Children have a way of reminding adults that hope doesn't disappear. It just hides until someone gives it permission to return. By afternoon, the wall gleamed under a new coat, smooth and fresh. They stepped back together to look at it, their reflections faint in the sheen. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about claiming it differently. The pain had lived there. Now something steadier did. Maya smiled, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. Healing, she thought, was not an event, but an occupation. Rumors still circled through Maple Ridge. They traveled through supermarket aisles and over fences, disguised as casual conversation. People needed explanations for what they couldn't categorize. Why was Ethan spending so much time near the teacher? Why did she stay when the town clearly wanted her gone? Every whisper tried to assign motives that made sense to the speaker. But the two of them stopped explaining. They answered gossip with presence, replaced stories with consistency. Breakfasts were shared, lessons were planned, engines were fixed. They didn't defend their choices. They lived them. The ordinary became their protest, a quiet rebellion against erasure. Ethan began to understand that love of neighbor was not a sentiment, but a discipline. It wasn't built on grand gestures or declarations. It was built on habits. He started learning those habits from Maya. When to check in, when to hold space, when to listen without solving. He learned where the extra brushes were kept, when the porch light should be turned on before dusk, when a silence needed company instead of words. Each small act rewrote him in ways he didn't notice until later. Courage, he discovered, grew roots when watered by repetition. The town didn't change overnight. No one apologized or suddenly welcomed them into the fold. But something subtle began to shift. People who used to turn away now nodded, brief acknowledgments that didn't carry approval but hinted at reconsideration. A few kind gestures appeared, a wave from a passing car, a loaf of bread left quietly on Maya's porch. They were small, almost imperceptible, but together they accumulated like coins in a jar. Not enough to buy forgiveness or erase harm, but enough to prove that a future was still possible. The air turned crisp as autumn crept in. Maple leaves burned red along the sidewalks, the sky wide and indifferent above them. One morning, Sophie came home from school clutching a flyer for the town's annual fall festival. It listed the parade route in bold letters, the line winding directly past Ethan's auto shop. He looked at the paper for a long moment, realizing what it meant. This wasn't just a parade. It was an invitation to be visible, or to disappear again. The choice, like the weather, was coming whether he was ready or not. Visibility is a promise you make with your feet. The morning of the fall festival arrived draped in the golden hush of early October. Maple Ridge prepared itself with banners and brass music, the smell of cinnamon, and the sound of polished boots on pavement. The streets were lined with people, every porch claimed, every face turned toward Main Street. It was the same festival they'd held for years, but this year, something beneath the celebration had shifted. It wasn't in the decorations or the music, it was in the air, tense with the possibility of choice. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, Sophie's small hand resting in his, Maya on the other side. The parade had not yet started, but the stares already had. He could feel them, 100 unspoken opinions in the weight of glances. It wasn't anger anymore. It was assessment, the town taking inventory of courage it hadn't asked for. For a moment, he wondered if standing there would make life harder for Sophie, if this visibility would follow her the way silence once had. But then Maya shifted slightly closer, and Sophie's grip tightened, as if to say the decision had already been made. When the first drum sounded, Ethan felt the rhythm in his chest. The crowd cheered as the Marching band passed, their uniforms bright, their horns gleaming. Behind them came floats of local businesses, familiar faces waving. Then came the section where families joined, the casual, friendly walk that turned into a quiet act of belonging. Ethan inhaled, straightened, and stepped forward with Maya and Sophie at his side. They moved slowly, not hiding, not hurrying. The crowd parted for them in the way water splits around a stone, uneasy but inevitable. Some faces hardened, others softened. No one said a word, but in the silence, meaning rippled through the street. Ethan realized the parade wasn't a test of acceptance. It was a reflection of endurance. The simple act of walking became its own declaration. A group near the grocery store whispered loudly enough to be heard. The words were meant to sting, but Maya didn't flinch. Her calmness wasn't denial. It was defiance without spectacle. Another group, quieter, watched with something else in their eyes. The early stirrings of understanding. People who had once looked past her were now watching her, as if seeing her for the first time. The path they walked did not require permission, only steadiness. Ethan discovered that steadiness was something he could finally offer. Halfway down Main Street, Sophie tugged on Maya's sleeve, pulling her toward a booth lined with small prizes. There, she won a trinket, a tiny painted bird, its wings spread mid-flight. Without hesitation, she pressed it into Maya's hand. The gesture was innocent, unplanned, but it transformed the moment. Around them, conversation softened. The sight of a child giving freely where adults had withheld changed something subtle in the crowd. Innocence, Ethan thought, wasn't weakness. It was a quiet kind of instruction. By the time the parade ended, the tension had shifted into a heavy calm. The world hadn't transformed, but the day had been marked. The three of them walked back through streets that no longer felt foreign. A few people nodded, almost shyly as they passed. It wasn't approval, but acknowledgement, a beginning. When evening came, the shop lights glowed warm against the dusk. The garage door, once scarred by hate, now stood smooth and gray, the color of labor, not memory. Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching Sophie chase the last of the sunlight, while Maya stood beside him, quiet and still. The street was the same, the town unchanged. Yet everything felt different. It wasn't that they had altered the world, it was that they had refused to be erased from it. Ethan looked at Maya and thought of the bridge they had built, one not made of wood or steel, but of small decisions and steady endurance. He realized he had spent years avoiding the kind of courage that would have made his daughter proud. Now, standing beside the woman his town once shunned, he felt the unfamiliar comfort of belonging earned, not granted. Maya, for her part, felt something equally rare, a version of home in a place that had tried to deny it. Together, they had turned surviving into belonging, and belonging into something that looked like hope. The night deepened over Maple Ridge, the air cooling, the stars beginning to appear one by one. The festival music faded in the distance, replaced by the soft hum of ordinary life continuing. It was not a triumphant ending, but it was an honest one. Change in this town would move slowly, as all real change does, but it would move, and sometimes, Ethan thought, as Sophie's laughter carried across the darkening street, movement itself was the miracle. Maybe silence protects us for a while, but it also protects what's wrong. If this story touched you, share it with someone who still believes kindness can change a heart. Every story like this reminds us that love isn't loud, it's consistent. But tell me, if speaking up cost you your comfort, would you still do it?